I rent out the downstairs of a 2-story house. My landlord is pretty diligent and good about taking care of stuff around here and just paid $6,000 to have the driveway paved so parking would be easier. The home next door is a giant house with a few apartments and a single-lane driveway for 2 cars that leads to the backyard, but one of the tenants owns a bunch of cars, 5 plus, and a giant repair plow truck and is always doing work day and night on these cars, ignoring noise ordinances and using drills and floodlight and letting the apartment look like a junkyard, so just an overall jerk. Because of all the cars and miscellaneous garbage, the tenants have to switch cars around every day so that the big truck can get in and out of a parking spot and everyone else can find parking at any given time around his stuff. There is a short fence between our 2 driveways made of metal piping that's been there for 50-plus years to divide the driveways, but when we had our drive paved, he paid to have someone come and rip it all out. I didn't even notice anything, but my landlord noticed big tire tracks on the fresh pavement and in the backyard, and noticed the fencing was gone. When she asked the neighbor, he boasted that now that we have our driveway paved, it's easier for him to park and maneuver his truck around, so he had all the fencing taken down so he can use our backyard to turn his truck around and park in our driveway. My landlord was stunned that he just decided on his own that he would be parking in our backyard and on our driveway. The pavement is only a few inches thick, so his truck would crack it relatively easily, and his truck will certainly create tracks in the backyard come spring when the ground is soft, not to mention that he just does not live here. So I came home last night and the landlord is outside with her fiancé putting up this ugly chicken wire fencing and regaling the whole story to me, and told me to tell her if anything happens. Well, I come home from classes today and the guy is outside and runs over when I'm home and starts cussing me out for putting up a fence and telling me we need to take it down and pay him for half of the cost of removing the old fence. I didn't even know what to say. I just let him know that's not happening and he doesn't have permission to use the driveway or our yard. Well, while I was inside, he ripped out all the fencing we put up. I called my landlord and now she's dealing with the police and she took him to court and yada yada. I'm just flabbergasted at the absolute brazen entitlement that made him use our yard and take down stuff that is on our property. I didn't even think people like that existed. As a young adult fresh out of college, I found myself settling into the bustling city life. The anonymity of the city streets provided a sense of freedom, but it also brought me face to face with a variety of characters, some of whom seemed to possess an unwarranted sense of entitlement. Little did I know that one encounter with an entitled individual would forever be etched in my memory. Let me set the scene. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and I decided to explore a local bookstore. The smell of old books greeted me as I stepped through the door, and I relished the tranquility of the space. As I strolled through the aisles, my eyes danced across shelves filled with literary wonder. Suddenly, my attention was captured by an animated conversation happening nearby. Intrigued, I moved closer to the source of the commotion. 2 women, one older and the other younger, stood near the fantasy section, arguing over a single copy of a highly anticipated novel. The older woman was the epitome of entitlement, with her haughty demeanor and disdainful expression. "Excuse me, young lady," the older woman barked, her voice dripping with condescension. "I had my eye on that book first. I demand that you give it to me immediately." I watched as the younger woman, who appeared to be around my age, raised an eyebrow and replied, "Actually, ma'am, I've been searching for this book for weeks. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to give it up." The entitled woman's face contorted into a mixture of anger and disbelief. She leaned in closer to the younger woman and hissed, "How dare you speak to me like that? I am a loyal customer of this bookstore, and I deserve that book more than you do." At this point, I couldn't resist getting involved. It was like watching a train wreck unfold, and I just had to witness it up close. Stepping forward, I interjected with a polite tone. "Excuse me, ladies, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Might I suggest a compromise? Perhaps you could both read the book together and share your thoughts afterward?" The entitled woman scoffed, giving me a disdainful look. "And who are you to interfere? This is none of your business." I couldn't help but respond with a hint of sarcasm. "Oh, forgive me, Your Highness. I'm just a lowly bystander trying to bring peace to the kingdom of literature." My remark seemed to further enrage the entitled woman. She glared at me, her face turning an alarming shade of red. "How dare you mock me? I'll have you know that I demand respect." The young woman beside me stifled a laugh, clearly amused by the absurdity of the situation. She turned to the entitled woman and said, "Look, I understand that you want the book, but that doesn't give you the right to act this way. It's just a book, after all." The entitled woman's anger reached its boiling point. With a sudden burst of fury, she reached out and attempted to snatch the book from the younger woman's hands. The bookstore fell into a hushed silence as their struggle ensued, books falling from nearby shelves in the chaos. Before I knew it, store employees rushed to our aid, separating the two women and restoring order to the bookstore. The entitled woman was escorted out, her demands and angry protests echoing in the air. As the dust settled, I turned to the younger woman, who was slightly shaken but still wearing a smirk. "Well, that was an adventure, huh?" She chuckled and extended her hand. "I'm Emily, by the way. Thanks for stepping in back there." I shook her hand warmly, introducing myself as well. We spent the next hour chatting about our shared love for books, and she recommended a few titles I had never heard of. It turned out that this encounter led to a new friendship, a bond formed in the face of entitlement and chaos. That day at the bookstore taught me a valuable lesson about entitlement and the power of standing up for what is right. It also reminded me to approach life with a touch of sarcasm, for sometimes it's the best defense against those who think they deserve everything. And as I continued my journey through the city streets, I knew that I would encounter more entitled individuals, but armed with the memory of that day, I felt ready to face them head on. After all, life is too short to let entitled people ruin the joy of a good book or the simple pleasures of everyday encounters. I live in a consolidated county. That means that the city and county governments merged some years back, ostensibly to reduce administrative and infrastructure costs. This is important because services like fire, police, utilities, and trash pickup are now managed by former county officials and not the city officials. Many of these services are also much more inefficient, and some services have been outsourced to private companies. My municipality outsourced trash and yard waste pickup a few years ago, and the two companies who now do those collections are woefully inadequate, and their services cost more than when the city or county did it. They both have similar sets of rules about what can be put out for collection, take fewer types of waste away, and no longer come 2 days a week as the city once did, but now only come 1 day a week. We're all paying more money for less service. Now that the background is done, here's the story. I did some yard work over the course of a couple of weekends last summer, cutting some limbs, trimming some shrubbery, and cutting down a dead tree in my backyard. Knowing what the rules are for how much yard waste, limbs, leaves, and such can be put out, I bagged everything that was supposed to be bagged, filling up 3 of them. Things like leaves and small clippings, weeds, and such. The paper bags for yard waste from the big box home improvement stores are what they require, so I use those. I just fill them halfway up so as to not make them too heavy for the waste collectors, even though there are no written weight restrictions. However, if a bag is too full, they will knock it over to spill out the contents so they then don't have to pick it up. I cut the larger limbs down to under 4 feet in length, or they wouldn't be picked up. Anything at all they can do to get out of picking something up, they will do, and they almost always leave a horrendous mess behind when they do pick things up. The pile put out for collection is not allowed to be any wider than 10 feet, nor any deeper or higher than 5 feet, nor may it contain any piece longer than 4 feet. All bags must be placed in a row, no more than 3 feet away from the limb pile. My pile was maybe 4 inches longer than the 10 feet, and only because of the tiny ends of the limbs, smaller than a toothpick, hanging out of the pile. The pile was no higher than 3 feet and no deeper than 4 feet. In other words, it fell within the size limits, except for a few twigs with leaves. I also had the 3 bags, each about half full of clippings and leaves, all lined up exactly as required and about 2 feet away from the main pile. They were scheduled to come on a Tuesday, but when I got home from work that afternoon, it was all still there. There was a pre-printed notice on my door that my pickup exceeded the proscribed size limits, and the note said that I would be required to either pay a $250 oversized load fee or reduce the size of the pile by half to make it fit into the limit. This is where revenge comes in. I had the next 2 days off, so the next morning, bright and early, I got out the hedge trimmers. I trimmed the ends of the pile back to exactly 9 feet in length, after carefully laying those trimmed bits on top of the pile. I went to the backyard, where the limbs I had not trimmed up the week before were stacked for the following week's pile, and found 4 long, fairly straight limbs. I removed all the smaller limbs and leaves from these limbs, ending up with 4 moderately straight poles, each about 7 feet long. I marked 1-foot intervals on each pole in fluorescent orange paint and stuck them in the ground, out at the curb in the front yard, at the corners of a rectangle exactly 5 feet wide and 10 feet long. I then got out the surveyor's tape, bright pink plastic tape used to mark property corners, and tied it onto and around the stakes at the height of 5 feet. This established a visual outline of the volume I was required to stay within. I made absolutely sure that everything in the pile was completely inside the poles and below 5 feet in height. This required adding almost 2/3 of the remaining pile in the backyard to the stack out front to bring it up to 4 feet 6 inches in width, 4 feet 6 inches in depth, and 9 feet 6 inches in length, and no pieces longer than 46 inches. The pile was almost twice as much material as before. I carried each of the 3 bags of clippings to the backyard and filled each of them up as much as possible, while still being able to fold over the tops and staple shut each bag. I also included small sections of the ends of larger limbs for added weight. The bags were now completely filled and weighed more than twice what they had before. I had to use the hand truck to get them out to the curb. They were so heavy. Oh, and all the extra clippings I had generated filled up 2 more bags, so the total was now 5 bags, the company limit. I then went inside, called the company, and very nicely asked that they come to pick up my yard waste, since they had not done so on Tuesday. They agreed to send out a truck and crew and told me I would have to pay the fee. "Come on then," I told them. They soon arrived and happened to be the same crew that normally comes to my neighborhood. I pulled a 25-foot Stanley tape measure from my pocket and asked them to measure the poles to confirm that the space was within the required limits. They did so, and agreed the pile was not oversized, and proceeded to spend the next 2 hours manually loading it all onto their truck. Oh, and it took both of them to manhandle each of those bags into the back of the truck, too. I told them, very nicely, and with a smile, that I knew what 10 feet was, pointed to the fence where it was marked with orange electrical tape, and thanked them for coming to pick up my yard waste. The 2 tired, sweaty waste disposal guys just groaned, got in their truck, and drove off. There was no extra fee added to my bill for that month. Never has been since. Now, I know they got paid for their time, and I know that I had to do a lot of extra work on my day off, but since last July, I have not once ever had them leave so much as a single leaf on the ground in front of my house. They had to actually do some hard work with me standing there in shorts, smiling and drinking cold water while they were sweating.